Okay, thank you very much for that. I think somebody said never knowingly oversold. I think that's the biggest oversell I've ever heard in my life. And I'm also sort of comforted by the fact that when somebody mentions regulatory and compliance, the room doesn't empty instantly, which is usually the case. So I was particularly keen to come to this gathering today because my history goes back quite a long way. I was talking to Duncan Eaton about this just earlier, about the days when I used to go to interminable meetings about barcode adoption in the NHS. And no progress ever seemed to happen. You'd go to meeting after meeting and the whole thing was hopelessly painful. The thing that shocked me about this, and I was a little bit sceptical about the pace at which the NHS was going to be able to demonstrate the UDI, barcoding and all of this electronic data stuff was going to work for them, was the pace at which this has actually happened. I've been quite stunned, and I'm really quite optimistic for the future. But clearly, there's a lot of rollout to be done. I think Bob and others, Bob Alexander's already said things that I was going to say. In some respects, it's all about information, really. And as a regulator, information informs decisions. I come from the private sector, and information usually underpinned decision-making. Moving into the public sector, I found it was really difficult often to find information to underpin decisions, and particularly in the regulatory arena, where there's a lot of very complex issues we have to deal with, and often the data to support those decisions is patchy, incomplete, and the like. So the reason I've got very involved in this process is because it's absolutely critical to what we do. And what do? We are about patient safety. Patient safety is our business, and we do that not on our own, but in conjunction with others. And it's not just patient safety, it's patient outcomes. It's better patient outcomes. So don't forget there's the safety bit, which is the cautious bit, but there's also the innovation. How do we do things better tomorrow, which is important. So I'm going to rush through quite a lot of slides here, and probably I'll avoid boring you if I can with the detail, but there is quite a lot of detail. But first, a little bit of a backdrop. The medical devices legislation in Europe, and we're part of the European medical devices legislation at the moment, and will be for the foreseeable future, I think, in terms of the written word, were introduced in the early 90s. And really, they replaced a patchwork of national legislation which worked more or less well, often less well. And they've been evolving ever since, and there's a new set of regulations in process. But the old days, it was quite easy to get stuff done. You know, there were 10 or 12 member states. You could put them in a room, and you could get things organised, and the legislation came out, and it was structurally quite sound, I think. We've now moved on, of course, and those 3 directives, which are transposed into national legislation, are now 2 regulations, which we're at the starting process of implementing. So, and of course, the EU has expanded, and the system as a whole includes EFTA, which is Norway. It even includes Turkey, and there's mutual recognition with Australia. So this is a very large and porous regulatory system in some respects, which is much bigger than the EU itself. So why the changes? Well, I am old enough to have possessed a mobile phone like the one that's pictured on the left. By 2012, when the proposals for this legislation came out, it had moved to something like that on the right, and now, of course, that looks like an antique, which should be in the Victoria and Albert Museum. So the big driver was that when the legislation was written and drafted, the technology and the sort of changes in technology that have taken place in the 20 years or so that have intervened was unimaginable. So things have moved dramatically. Not least of which has pressured change. We've had the PIP breast implant saga, scandal, whatever you want to call it, certainly a scandal. We've had a lot of issues with hips, particularly metal-on-metal hips, which which started out with the best intentions, with very specific patient needs in mind when you're trying to design innovation, but the results weren't what was expected and damaged patients in the end. And of course, currently in the headlines, the use of meshes for a variety of surgical interventions, but particularly urogynecological interventions at the moment. So there's a lot of noise around those. What I would say is, in most of the cases where there's a perceived device failure, it's very rarely binary. Most failures are failures of a process, as others have already said, and involve elements of that process, including, of course, the surgeon, the device, the patient, who are infinitely variable. So there's a vast amount of variability in there. But actually, in almost every case, information is short. We don't have enough information to decisively act quickly if the need arises. And I think the whole GS1 exercise gives us the opportunity to massively enhance the amount of information and act in the right way for patients. So regulation upgrades. Well, this is a major upgrade. As a bureaucrat now, you might think my eyes would light up at the fact that we've gone from 60 pages to 170 pages, 23 articles to 123 articles, and 12 annexes to 7. It's a lot of paper. But the reality is the first iteration lacked quite a lot of detail. Its architecture was good, but actually a lot of the detail that we've learned using this regulatory system needed to be filled in the interim. So what are the major changes? Well, a lot of increases in requirements for clinical investigation of medical devices, clinical evidence to support products as they go onto the market. A lot of work around cooperation across the system. We've already done a lot of work to improve that. Because it's a mutual recognition system across Europe, it's almost only as good as its weakest link. So the links between the member states and working together is critical. And then there's a lot about transparency, because this was legislation which was designed to sort of facilitate the single market, or it came under an umbrella of that. There were a lot of provisions which were unhelpful. What I would say also in this area is post-market surveillance is another area which has been added into and built on. And post-market surveillance is basically the obligation on manufacturers and others to collect information about how these things are actually performing in real life. And you can see the link to GS1 on that front. Bottom of that list is the introduction of a UDI system, Unique Device Identifier System. And I think there's already been quite a lot of reference to this. The GS1 scan for safety issue is all around collecting information about stuff, people, events, and such like. This is one component of the system. So what is a unique identifier? Well, it can come in various forms. It looks like a barcode. On the left, it could be RFID. It could be all sorts of things. It's a series of characters. It's internationally accepted. There's a global exercise going on to try and ensure that the way that UDI data is collected is exchangeable worldwide. Very important to us, may not be very important. Well, it is very important. It's very important to patients. It allows us to pool information, learn from that information, and pick up issues sooner rather than later. It's also allows us unambiguous identification of specific devices. That's very important. A lot of the information that we get, the sort of information that we used to get through the NRLS system, for instance, was useless for us because we could, while there was an event registered, we couldn't tie it to any specific device and such like. So actually, it was interesting, but not really very useful. So tagging the specific device to specific events and an unambiguous exchange of information clearly is vitally important to us, and often very difficult. So what's UDI? Well, it comes in two parts. There's static data, the stuff that's actually captured in the label, and then there's dynamic data, which sits on a database. So static data is really, what is the product, basically, identifying that specific item. The dynamic data is lots of stuff about manufacturing. It's the batches, it's the batch history of it's history of the product, all sorts of stuff that you couldn't possibly ram into a barcode, but actually is vital to us and manufacturers doing their job properly. So it's those two components are critical because it's very easy to put the label on the product, less easy to construct the database. So where does GS1 fit into this? Well, GS1 is a system for facilitating unique device identifier capture. There are other systems, and actually each of the elements of the unique device identifier translate across to GS1 elements. So this is a sort of pattern, a template for working, which could be applied to others. I would say GS1 seems to be largely accepted by most of the health systems that are emerging and most of the manufacturers in this space. So in the competitive environment of potential suppliers of identification systems or barcoding systems or whatever you want to call them, GS1 clearly is the 400-pound gorilla. So moving on to it, why are we interested in it? Well, I think we're interested in it for all the reasons that Keith Jones so beautifully described this morning. It gives us granularity of information, of linking procedures, patients, and devices. So from our perspective, how does that translate? We want better incident reporting. We want more incidents to be reported to us. We know that incidents don't get reported to us in quite large quantities for a variety of reasons, not usually malicious, largely because it's difficult, painful exercise. This facilitates or should help to enable improving incident reporting and doing it in a seamless and I wouldn't say effortless way, but certainly a much more less burdensome way. So that allows manufacturers and us to target recalls of products. That's very transactional. But often, if we go out to the system and say, we need to know where these products which were sent out 2 years ago are. There's 2 batches of products, or a manufacturer will do that. We need to recall them. They shouldn't be used anymore. It takes weeks, months to reconcile the situation and find these things. And often, some of them aren't found, which constitutes a significant patient risk. So, and actually, just the effort of transacting recalls is huge for everybody concerned. So I think recalls should be facilitated easily, and that was the sort of low-hanging fruit of this exercise, really. But it also allows us to monitor what's going on better. We have access to better data pools in terms of what's happening with products out there on the market. It allows us to monitor how, whether the manufacturer's actually transacted all the things they're going to say they're going to do in a field safety action if there is a product with a problem. Clearly, ultimately, reducing medical errors is the core of this. And we heard yesterday, or I wasn't here, unfortunately, but my colleagues were here, Terence Stevenson talking about the opportunity for that, and we've seen a video which actually exemplifies that. And medical errors are often not, the sort of things that are unexpected. They're living and working in a very complex, difficult environment. So the tools to help prevent that, I think, would be critical. And I think the interaction between drugs, devices, clinicians, patients, and such like, there's plenty of scope for developing quite sophisticated ways of improving the way things work. We have a major set of programs around counterfeits. I'm talking about devices. My colleagues in medicines have a bigger issue because counterfeit medicines are generally a bigger issue, but counterfeit devices are a fairly substantial issue and are growing. As the economic incentives grow, then people will counterfeit and they will get up to no good. This is one of the ways and one of the mechanisms that helps us to counter that. And of course, Stock management is your business, but we are interested in it because actually we're interested in not using products that are out of date. We're interested in whether products are maintained and serviced appropriately and correctly, because all of those things constitute to the safe and effective use of medical devices. So, lots of reasons why we're interested as partners in this whole network of people working towards better outcomes for patients. So, just looking more widely, the whole UDI system was really initiated substantially by the FDA several years ago. And they're, as you might expect, some way ahead of us in terms of what they're doing. They issued their full set of rules around unique device identifiers back in September 2018. And then they and us, via this organisation called the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, it's where us regulatory geeks get together and talk about the details of regulation, primarily focused at harmonisation, because harmonisation is good. It stops things falling through the cracks. But in this context, it's vital, because again, and I can step back in time and with vivid memories around the PIP activities when the world was looking at data. The Australians, the Americans, the Germans, the French, everybody was looking at data, and nobody had any absolute certainty that the data they were looking for was actually comparing eggs with eggs. So getting unique identifiers universally and internationally exchangeable is critical to the way that we can work. And the more data you have, often an individual country might have a weak signal of a problem, and you could say, well, there might be a problem, but we really don't know. You start pooling that, and suddenly you go, hang on a minute, this isn't a weak signal, this is a signal, we need to go and investigate this and see what's going on. So pretty critical to everybody. So the US established their database, which is this the sort of the dynamic part of the UDI, but it's not a global one, it's an FDA one. But basically they've been working their way through forcing manufacturers to put their information on the database. They started with the high-risk devices, the class 3, top of the risk profile, and they're still working through the lower risk devices, of which there's very, very large numbers. So the FDA are off and out of the trap very rapidly, and the rest of us are following to an extent. European UDI regulations are very much part of the new regulatory framework, which was published in May this year, came into force in July. UDI is just one tiny bit of a whole set of overarching things, but again, it's been designed to be consistent with the global requirements in this context. So lots of stuff captured in the legislation, which if you want to trawl through, you can find. But actually, I'm not going to bore you with that, but I will capture some of the more interesting bits. It says the system should allow the identification and traceability of medical devices and IVDs. Very simple statement, historically very difficult. It defines the two parts, which I've already described. It talks about UDIs being on labelling. It talks about, interestingly for European legislation, which is designed to regulate manufacturers, it talks about stored by manufacturers, importers, distributors, and hospitals. So we've got a slight encroachment of European legislation into areas which perhaps others would consider they shouldn't be encroaching on, which is what hospitals should do. And then the Commission are challenged with setting up this database, which is no small task. So, what's going to be used for? Well, records in the database. It's going to be included in technical documentation. Every product has a technical file, which is all the evidence which supports its safety and performance and why it's safe to put the product on the market. Against that, the companies have to declare conformity with all of the rules associated with their product according to risk category. It'll appear in public domain in terms of a summary of safety and clinical performance. So if you maybe a patient who's had a hip implant, you should be able to, if essentially in the future, take the information about that, the UDI data, and track it straight into a European database which gives you a summary of the information around the safety and performance of that product if you're interested. And many people will be. It involves other things around safety communications, which I think I've talked, and certification. So in some respects, it's the glue that makes sure the system fits together and that we are comparing eggs with eggs in a whole raft of regulatory processes. So, issuing in Europe, the legislation, like the Americans, will say that it will designate issuing agencies. It will be several. GS1's one. HIBIC is probably likely to be another. They will all have access to systems for interested parties. So patients will have access to a lot of this information, which they in the past wouldn't necessarily have had. And the Commission are committed to, once the thing's up, or getting the thing up and running and supporting it for 10 years. I'm assuming that means that it will support itself thereafter. But you never know with these things. This is, don't look at the detail, obviously, on this slide. It's a bit, but essentially, historically, the linkage between manufacturers and importers and distributors, the sort of upper end of the supply chain has been pretty good. Industry has been pretty good at tracking goods in, stuff in process in the factories, goods out, and tracking it to distributors. Where the whole system has tended to fall down is as it gets closer to the patient and products get lost or they're delivered, they're lost in inventory, and that creates enormous amount of problems for everybody concerned. So I think traceability throughout the system has always been an obligation on manufacturers that they can demonstrate they've got it. The reality is they've struggled to be actually deliver on that. So UDI should help them to do that. So UDI, I think we've talked this in some respects, specific about recalls. I think I've done that one to death. People implanted with devices will have implant cards given them now, so they actually know what's in them. Most people don't. When there's a public safety issue, we get all sorts of phone calls from people panicking about whether they've got this product inside them or not. They don't know whether it was a Stryker hip, J&J hip, or a Zimmer hip. So that's important, and it allows people to, again, access information. And as I said before, it's all about the glue that holds the system together. Recording of, I think I've covered this already. Hospitals under the legislation are obliged to collect information. How that's enforced, I don't know, but clearly it's happening here. It's not happening in other member states. We're ahead of the game, potentially, here. We have the opportunity to be well ahead of the game. So the database, I'm not going to go through that again. I think we've covered that. This rather complex illustration really describes the aspirations and what's written in the legislation in Europe, which is to have a huge database which links all of these bits together. And the unique device identifier actually props up in all of these different parts and allows information to flow between the different bits. So just running on quickly, European timelines, well, we're, as you can see, well behind the Americans. The higher risk products need to be effectively UDI needs to be in place by 2021, subject to the databases being in place. And the implementation to the lower areas runs out to substantially later dates into the mid-2020s. So, just by way of wrap-up, I've talked about a lot of mechanical details which are, kind of, interesting, but not really the main point. The main point about UDI is it's a critical enabler of information gathering, storage, analysis, and more importantly, exchange across the system. So the simple stuff is we can do traceability better. That's, So what? Actually, the big benefits for me are around outcome tracking at a local level. Maybe individual surgeons can track individual devices and individual procedures. Nationally, where we want to pool that information, and then often internationally, where we can pull the whole thing together in a meaningful way. The big prize, and I think Gavin already alluded to this in many respects earlier on, is the potential for huge-scale epidemiological research and analysis, because we have this information embedded in the system, attached to patient records, attached to the system. And that's the real prize. So we know that procedures are doing what they say they should do, or there's scope for improvement. So for me, as a device regulator, although we're interested in one element, the systemic impact is potentially huge. And if we can embed that, it will help me to do my job properly. Thank you.